Mercedes were supposed to be caught. The FIA had already stepped in. The hot engine trick was supposed to be gone. The dangerous hybrid exploit was supposed to be banned. And Max Verstappen was supposed to finally have a clear shot at Mercedes in Monaco. Then Kimi Antonelli crossed the line. Pole position. By 43 thousandths of a second. And now the paddock has a terrifying problem. Because if Mercedes were still fast after the FIA clampdown, then maybe the rule makers did not stop the advantage. Maybe they only found the easiest part of it. Think about what this means. A reported 0.3 per lap engine gain. A new hot test at 130 degrees Celsius. A front wing investigation. A banned emergency shutdown trick. A sudden power loss scare that involved Verstappen himself. And after all of that, Antonelli still beat him on the one circuit where there is nowhere to hide. So the question is no longer, are Mercedes too fast? The question is, what if Mercedes are too complete to stop? Because the FIA can close a loophole. Verstappen can apply pressure. Rivals can search every inch of the car. But if the real secret is not one trick, if it is the entire Mercedes system, then Monaco may not have exposed them. It may have revealed how far ahead they really are. Subscribe to the channel. To understand why Antonelli's Monaco pole hit like an alarm bell, you have to start with what Mercedes were supposed to lose. Because Monaco was not just another qualifying session. It was supposed to be the first real test of a Mercedes without the controversy protecting it. For weeks, the paddock had been watching the same story build. Mercedes were too fast. Not a little too fast. Not fast in one convenient place. Too fast in a way that made rival teams uncomfortable, because the advantage seemed to survive everywhere. Different circuits. Different conditions. Different types of corners. And still, the W17 kept looking like the car everyone else was trying to understand. That is where suspicion begins in Formula 1. Not when a team is quick once. When a team is quick repeatedly, and nobody can explain the full reason. Mercedes had Kimi Antonelli leading the Drivers' Championship. George Russell was sitting second. The team was controlling the Constructors' Championship. And in a new regulation era, that kind of dominance is never treated as a coincidence. Because Formula 1 teams do not believe in miracles. They believe in causes. If a car is faster, something is making it faster. If a team keeps winning, something is feeding the advantage. If both drivers are near the front, the answer is not luck. It is hidden somewhere in the machine. And the first place rivals looked was the engine. That is where the biggest controversy began. The new power unit rules had changed the sport. Cars were now relying on a much more complex balance between combustion power and electrical energy. In simple terms, the engine was no longer just about burning fuel. It was about heat, timing, energy flow, and control. And Mercedes seemed to have found something others had missed. The key word was compression. Inside an engine, air and fuel are squeezed before they burn. The tighter that mixture is squeezed, the more force the engine can produce. Think of it like pressing down on a spring. The harder you press, the stronger it snaps back. That squeeze is powerful. So the rules placed a limit on it. 16:1. That was the maximum compression ratio. But the problem was not just the limit. The problem was how the limit was tested. According to the source material, the original check happened when the engine was cold, sitting in the pit lane, at ambient temperature. That sounds fair. The car is still. The officials can measure it. The conditions are controlled. But racing does not happen in controlled conditions. A Formula 1 engine does not fight for pole while sitting cold in a garage. It races hot. Under pressure. Under vibration. Under forces that make materials expand and tiny gaps shift. A part that measures one way when cold can behave differently when it is at full operating temperature. And that is where rivals believed Mercedes had found the opening. Cold, the engine could appear legal. Hot, it allegedly behaved as if the compression ratio had climbed higher. That is why the controversy was so explosive. Because this was not about a giant illegal device sitting in plain sight. It was about the space between inspection and reality. The car that passed the cold test may not have been the same car, in performance terms, that raced at full temperature. And if that sounds like a small detail, it is not. The reported advantage was up to 0.3 of a second per lap. 0.3. In Formula 1, that is huge. That can change qualifying. That can change strategy. That can protect tires. That can make a driver look calmer than he really is, because the car is giving him margin others do not have. And Monaco made that number even more brutal. Antonelli took pole by 43 thousandths of a second. Less than a blink. Less than a breath. A margin so tiny that one slight correction could have changed the entire front row. So when people heard about a possible 0.3 advantage, and then saw Mercedes take pole by 43 thousandths, the connection was impossible to ignore. But here is where the story becomes even more dangerous for the FIA. By Monaco, the governing body had already moved. The hot engine loophole was supposed to be closed. The FIA changed the way the engine would be assessed. It would no longer be judged only when cold. It would also be checked at a representative operating temperature of 130 degrees Celsius. In plain English, the FIA stopped asking, "What does this engine look like when it is resting?" It started asking, "What does this engine become when it is working?" That was the clampdown. That was supposed to remove the suspected Mercedes advantage. That was supposed to give Verstappen, Ferrari, Red Bull, McLaren, and everyone chasing Mercedes a clearer fight. And that is why Monaco became more than a Grand Prix weekend. It became a truth test. If Mercedes dropped back, the story would be simple. The trick had been the advantage. The FIA closed it. The field recovered. But if Mercedes stayed fast, the story would become much darker. Because that would mean the engine controversy was not the whole secret. It was only one layer. Then Antonelli delivered the lap pole at Monaco after the clampdown. And suddenly, the paddock did not have an answer. It had a bigger question. Because Mercedes were supposed to be exposed. Instead, they looked dangerous again. And the driver who delivered the proof was not a veteran managing a familiar storm. It was a 19-year-old carrying the pressure of a championship, a team under suspicion, and Max Verstappen breathing down his neck. That is what made the moment so powerful. Antonelli did not just beat the clock. He beat the expectation that Mercedes would finally look ordinary. And for Verstappen, that mattered. Because he was not beaten by a comfortable margin. He was beaten by 43 thousandths. The smallest kind of defeat. The kind that makes every technical advantage feel personal. The kind that makes a driver and a team look back at every corner, every deployment phase, every braking zone, and ask where that time came from. At Monaco, 43 thousandths can be 1 inch closer to a wall. 1 earlier throttle application. 1 cleaner rotation. Or 1 hidden advantage the rest of the grid still does not understand. That is why the question became so explosive. Were Mercedes still benefiting from something the FIA had not fully caught? Or had the clampdown accidentally revealed an even scarier truth? Maybe Mercedes were not fast because of one trick. Maybe Mercedes were fast because their whole car was built better, smarter, and closer to the edge than everyone else's. That is the possibility rivals fear most. A loophole can be closed. A directive can be written. A test can be changed. But a complete system cannot be banned overnight. If Mercedes have found performance through the engine, the hybrid system, the aerodynamics, the tires, and the confidence the car gives Antonelli, then there is no single switch the FIA can flip to make the advantage disappear. And that is what Monaco appeared to suggest. The obvious door had been closed. Mercedes still walked through another one. But the engine was not the only reason the FIA and the rest of the paddock were watching Mercedes so closely. That is where this story becomes more dangerous. Because once a team is suspected of finding one gray area, nobody looks at the car the same way again. Every movement becomes suspicious. Every sudden gain becomes a clue. Every strange onboard angle starts spreading through the paddock like evidence. And Mercedes had already given rivals another reason to look. The front wing. At first, this seemed like a separate issue. A different part of the car. A different race weekend. A different technical question. But in Formula One, nothing is truly separate. The engine affects speed. Speed affects airflow. Airflow affects the front wing. The front wing affects balance. Balance affects the tires. And the tires affect the one thing every driver needs most at Monaco: trust. That is why the front wing controversy mattered so much. Earlier in the season, footage from the Chinese Grand Prix raised concerns around the Mercedes W17. Rival teams noticed unusual behavior from the front wing flaps under braking. The concern was that the flaps appeared to remain in an intermediate position, not fully behaving the way the rules expected them to behave within the required closing time. To a casual fan, that might sound tiny. But Formula One is built on tiny. A tiny angle. A tiny delay. A tiny movement under load. Those details can decide whether a driver feels the car is stable, or whether he feels like the rear could step away at any moment. The front wing is the first part of the car that touches the air. It decides how the air moves around everything behind it. The floor. The side pods. The rear wing. Even the tires. Think of it like the first person walking through a packed doorway. If that person moves straight, the crowd behind follows one path. If that person shifts slightly, everyone behind has to adjust. That is airflow around a Formula One car. So if the front wing behaves differently under braking, the entire car can feel different in the most important part of the corner. And braking is where Monaco becomes brutal. A driver arrives with the wall close, the front tires loaded, the rear of the car going light, and almost no margin for hesitation. In that moment, the driver is not just slowing down. He is asking the car to rotate, grip, settle, and prepare for acceleration, all in the space of a heartbeat. If the car gives him confidence, he attacks. If it does not, he leaves margin. And margin is lap time. That is why Antonelli's pole made the front wing question feel even more relevant. Because he did not look like a driver leaving margin. He looked committed, calm, precise. Like the Mercedes was giving him the kind of stability that lets a driver place the car inches from the barrier without flinching. That does not prove anything illegal. And this is important. The FIA investigated the front wing issue and cleared Mercedes. According to the source material, the behavior was not judged to be deliberate software manipulation. It was linked to insufficient hydraulic pressure, a design miscalculation that affected how the wing closed under certain air loads. No penalty came from that investigation. But in Formula One, being cleared does not always remove the suspicion. Sometimes it only changes the question. Because rivals now knew the behavior had been unusual enough to attract attention. They knew Mercedes had another system close enough to the edge to require explanation. And when that happens after a major engine controversy, the paddock does not see isolated incidents anymore. It sees a pattern. And patterns are what make teams nervous. One controversial idea can be called clever. Two can be called aggressive. Three can begin to look like a philosophy. That philosophy is simple and terrifying. Find the areas where the rules are hardest to police. Find the difference between what the rule says and what the test can actually catch. Find performance before the FIA knows exactly how to measure it. That is the fear around Mercedes. Not that one piece of the car was unusual, but that the whole car might have been designed with that mindset. And then came the third layer, the one Verstappen could not ignore. The hybrid qualifying trick. This was not just about lap time anymore. This was about safety. Under the new rules, cars had to reduce electrical energy deployment as they approached the timing line on a qualifying lap. But Mercedes and Red Bull reportedly found a way to use an emergency shutdown function connected to the hybrid system. The function existed for protection, for genuine faults, for moments when the car needed to shut something down before damage or danger became worse. But the controversial use was different. By triggering the emergency shutdown at the right moment, the car could avoid the normal power reduction for longer during qualifying. More power, for longer, at the exact point where the lap time mattered. An emergency feature became a performance weapon. And that is where the whole debate changed tone. Because using a gray area for speed is one thing. Using an emergency system for speed is another. Imagine every driver has to slow down before a finish line, but one driver discovers an emergency lane that lets him stay faster for a few more seconds. The lane exists for safety. It is legal to have it. But using it as part of the race changes the meaning of the rule. That is why the FIA had to step in. But before the directive came, the risk became visible on track. During the Japanese Grand Prix weekend, Antonelli and Max Verstappen both suffered dangerous power losses through corners. They were left moving slowly in high-speed sections while other cars were still arriving quickly. Alexander Albon was also affected by complications connected to the same system. That is not a minor technical problem. That is a driver sitting in a vulnerable car, in the wrong place, while others arrive at racing speed. And Verstappen was not hearing about this from the outside. He experienced it. That matters because it made the controversy more than a Mercedes question. It pulled one of Mercedes' biggest rivals directly into the safety side of the story. Verstappen was not just the driver Antonelli beat in Monaco. He was also one of the drivers affected by the danger created by this kind of exploit. So when Antonelli later took pole by 43 thousandths, Verstappen's presence made the result feel even heavier. Because the man chasing Mercedes had already been part of one of the controversies connected to how teams were using the new hybrid systems. Ferrari raised safety concerns after those incidents. The FIA responded with a technical directive. Emergency shutdowns had to be used only for legitimate emergencies. The system could not be used as a repeated performance shortcut. And Antonelli himself admitted the trick was not safe, while supporting the ban from a driver's safety point of view. That detail is powerful. Drivers do not normally welcome losing performance. They spend their careers chasing speed. If something makes the lap faster, they usually want to keep it. So when a driver says a trick is not safe, the issue has moved beyond politics.